My name is Alessandra Zimmerman. I am a longtime CSPC volunteer, and we are about to start the panel titled Connecting the Dots, Research, Security, and International Relations in a Warming Climate. If you are here to watch this, please take your seats. If you are not here to watch this, still take your seats. This year, CSPC provides simultaneous translation. So if you need Interprify, the QR code is at the back. We also have the conference mobile app, which has the survey that we all like you to fill out in the menu. So make sure you give these panelists feedback once they're done so that we can make the conference better every year. And remember to use the hashtag CSPC 2024 if you are tweeting, or I guess LinkedIn also has hashtags, anything from this panel. I would also like to remind you that today is the last day you can pick up a copy of our magazine. So if you have not yet, please stop by the registration table to pick it up. And we have a couple great sessions today, including a lunch session looking at CSPC's strategic plan and a plenary later on this afternoon. So make sure you stay through the whole day, not just for this interesting panel. So with that, I get to leave and Mario will take us away.
Thank you, Alessandra. Bon matin, collègues, et bienvenue. Je suis Mario Pinto, le vice-président de la recherche et internationale à l'Université de Manitoba. Je suis ravi d'être ici comme votre hôte pour cette émission. Ladies and gentlemen, I appear here also as a member of the governing circle of the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation. And I would like to remind all of us that we, across Canada, occupy the lands and waters of diverse Indigenous peoples. We respect the spirit and intent of treaties and treaty making, and remain committed to working in partnership with First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples in the spirit of truth, reconciliation, and collaboration. We acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past. We recognize the difficult history and legacy of the residential schools and other traumatic events, but look forward with optimism to admitting the truth and to a productive journey towards reconciliation. With that, let me introduce the issues for discussion by this panel today and set the scene. The changing climate will require a global adjustment to the resulting environmental changes, as well as geopolitical and societal frameworks, which have already begun. Within this setting, different interests are drivers for policy development and international relations. Advancement in science will be crucial and critical to enable the development of new technologies, providing resilience to the changes and help society to adapt, overcome challenges, and explore new opportunities. Upon this new reality, access to innovation, knowledge, and scientific advances will be paramount, in particular with respect to economic and geopolitical interests. The panel will discuss the impact and increased access to the North and what that will do, what impact that will have. The first slide shows the area that we are talking about and positions our discussion starting at the bottom in Winnipeg, featuring the Hudson Bay Railway and the Hudson Bay in particular. We have now accessed the Western Hudson Bay because climate change has made this very possible. We're now ice-free for 5 months of the year. And what we show here is access to the north, to the Arctic, through the Northwest Passage and the higher Arctic as well, where the ice is also changing dramatically. The panel will examine how such access will govern a few important things, but first let me show you that we are ready. We've positioned ourselves at the foot of the Hudson Bay, and this is the Churchill Marine Observatory that was just opened, okay, by the University of Manitoba. We will use that as a launch point for further exploration. The panel today will examine how such issues affect Canada's economic and territorial interests, security, sovereignty, as well as social and economic reconciliation opportunities by, with, and for Indigenous communities. And I emphasize economic reconciliation. The discussion will provide insight into the global research security and international relation nexus, with a particular emphasis on northern communities. Et maintenant, les membres de la table ronde. Dr. Andrea Charon joins us as Director of the Center for Defense and Security Studies at the University of Manitoba. If I can ask you to wave when I call your name. Thank you, Andrea. Dr. Charmaine Dean, unfortunately, could not join us because she is ill. She sends her regrets, but she has been replaced by Dr. Hans-Joachim Wieden, the Associate Vice President of Partnerships, Knowledge Mobilization, and Innovation at the University of Manitoba. Dr. Philip Ferguson is Director of the Space Technology and Advanced Research Lab, the STAR Lab, at the University of Manitoba. Dr. Christian Lupprecht is a Distinguished Professor at the Royal Military College of Canada and is a Senior Fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute think tank. And joining us online, and if I may have His Worship, the Mayor Michael Spence, who's the Mayor of Churchill in Manitoba. Okay. So welcome all. And with that, I think we can begin, but let me tell you a little bit in terms of format. To ensure that the session is interactive and dynamic, we will try to have an iterative session and include questions from the audience as we go. We will begin with opening statements from the panelists, 5 minutes each, followed by a discussion on questions that I will pose, and then questions from the audience, from all of you. We will conclude with the summary of the main points and suggest the next steps, not just from the panelists, but also from you. Okay? We will be summarizing this session in a discussion paper that will be circulated. Alors, on commence. So let me move now to the chair, and I will assume the role of moderator. Okay? So I would like to begin with His Worship, the Mayor Mike Spence, who brings a very different perspective from the community in the North. Mike, over to you.
Thank you. First of all, I apologize for not being in attendance in person, but climate change has its ways to even affect that in my travel to Ottawa to be there. But regardless, good morning, everybody. Introduced Mayor Mike Spence from the town of Churchill, a member of York Factory First Nations on Treaty 5 territory. Churchill is quite unique. It's a Treaty 5 territory, home of the Dene, the Cree, the Inuit, and also traditional homelands for the Métis. I've been involved in municipal politics since 1989. I did 2 terms as a councillor, deputy mayor, and in 1995, I took on the responsibility of being mayor of our beautiful community and continue to be the mayor today. So I've been always focused in economic development for the growth of our community and the region. When I became involved in politics, the first order of business that I took an interest in was to travel north. Travel to it was then the Keewatin district of the Northwest Territories. How time has flied. And now, as we all know, it's the Kivalliq district of Nunavut. So I've always been focused there because of the rail line connection, the transportation linkage, the partnerships that we have with the Inuit people as Indigenous people coming together. I am also the chairperson of the Arctic Gateway Group. The Arctic Gateway Group is an Indigenous-owned group and also Northern Manitoba-owned. We own the Port of Churchill, the Hudson Bay Rail Line, and the Churchill Marine Tank Farm. This undertaking that we have is quite unique. There isn't another model like it. So there you go. You've got a region that's taking a responsibility in leading. It's critically important that we take control of our destiny. And this is why I'm here as well today, is really to showcase, get involved, show the world that we have a deeply rooted responsibility to play a role and educate the people at large and who we represent, Canada as a whole. I'm also co-lead of the research project, along with Lavinia Brown. She's the other co-lead. The opportunity of refocusing, is quite extraordinary. It's all about capturing, imaginations and working through that. So, the whole aspect of the climate is changing. We all know that. And in fact, I look out the window today and there is no ice in the Hudson Bay along the shores of our community. Isn't that telling and daunting? But in light of that, we need to look at both the impacts as well as the opportunities for the future of the North. It's critically important that we do that. We're challenged naturally by the impacts. What does that mean? It means, as Indigenous peoples, as you go and do your traditional hunting, you're affected. For instance, as you know, Churchill is a destination, international destination for tourism. In fact, today is the last day of the bear season. So, what will tourism look like in the next 5, in the next 10, in the next 15 years? What's bear season going to look like? So it will be a challenge, but you know what? We're up for the challenge. It's all about adaptation that we need to do. Like not being able to travel out of our community the last few days indicates that we had freezing rain. We had power outages to clean the lines. These are some of the effects of climate change in northern communities. But, we're taking on that responsibility of leading, and the port assets are critically important. The ongoing partnership with science and research is really critical. Churchill's always been, a location of research and studies. It's always been, it goes back to when the military was there back in the day in the early 40s. And today our partnership with the university it's really a partnership that needs to continue to evolve. We will show the support and the viability of the port and the importance of prosperity for the region. Science is a critical partner in making this happen. As we move through this, REACH is a major new initiative to reimagine Canada's third seaway through Churchill and Hudson Bay. Its goal to transform social economic prosperity into the region of the Kivalliq, northern Manitoba, the high Arctic and the prairies, and across this great country, while contributing to the stability and security of global supply chains. REACH is is also led by Dr. Fei Wong of the University of Manitoba and co-led by myself, along with many community leaders, elders, and Indigenous knowledge holders. We believe that time has finally come to fully recognize the potential of the Port of Churchill due to the lengthening of the open water period in the Hudson Bay. The port has been in operation for 100 years, but up to now it's been operational for 3 to 5 months. It is due time to really reimagine and capture the prosperity that needs to happen. The challenges of the insurance rates that are outdated, the historical sea ice challenges in the Hudson Bay and the conditions. By bringing together a large team of researchers from communities, academia, government, and industry, we will co-develop knowledge and technology to ensure that new revitalized Hudson Bay Seaway will be designed and developed and managed in a way that is not only economic feasible, but also cultural sensitive and environmentally suitable. The scope of work includes baseline assessment on current human rights, One health and economic conditions in the region. Time is now. Climate change opens this unprecedented opportunity for the region to adapt by being proactive instead of being passive and responsive. The Arctic Gateway Group new ownership and operation model is one of its kind, and we look forward to greater opportunities. The University of Manitoba is internationally recognized and experienced in sea ice and climate change, including a newly operational Churchill Marine Observation Facility located in Churchill. Nationally, provincial and federal governments continued interest in the region to support our opportunities.
Thank you, Mike. We will return to expand on some of your comments.
Sure.
Very good food for thought to begin this session. Phil, if you want to take over.
Sure. Well, thanks very much. So my name is Phil Ferguson. I'm an associate professor of aerospace engineering and the director of the Space Technology and Advanced Research Lab, or STAR Lab, at the University of Manitoba. My research and my entire lab is dedicated to what we just heard from Mayor Mike, which is dedicated to making aerospace technology accessible to the people in this country and around the world that can actually use it. For so long, we have had aerospace technology being reserved for just the rich companies, the rich governments, the people that can afford a $300 million satellite and launch it on a $100 million rocket. Well, these days that's changing, but we need research in order to make that technology accessible to the communities like Churchill, like Chesterfield Inlet, and all of those up along the western coast of Hudson Bay that stand to not only benefit from improved shipping through Hudson Bay, but also stand to face some challenges, some risks. Due to the impacts that shipping can provide to the environment and the wildlife there as well. Now, my research looks at this access from a number of different perspectives. First of all, from space. You know, we know that quite often we've been using satellites, satellite technology to monitor our planet. And definitely we can use that to monitor how climate change is affecting the Arctic, which we know is happening at a rate 4 times faster than it is everywhere else on this planet. But it's not enough for us to just put satellites in space. You know, Canada's a leader in remote sensing. We launched the RadarSat Constellation mission a few years ago, designed and built right in Manitoba. However, that data right now is not getting to the people that need it the most. And this provides a security concern. The people in Churchill, the people in Chesterfield Inlet do not have dedicated access to the climate change information that we're collecting from space. And so part of the research that I'm doing with Churchill, with Chesterfield Inlet, Nunavut, is to co-develop satellite systems, drone systems that can help monitor this climate as it's changing and posing threats It's posing security concerns for hunters and trappers as they go out on the sea ice, they go out on the tundra to provide food and services for their families. They are at risk, and they are in need of technology that can let them know how the sea ice is changing around them, how the weather is changing around them. And as we improve shipping through Hudson Bay, where those ships are coming from. You know, I was in Chesterfield Inlet just last year, and I go there several times a year, and I was talking with some of the town's council, and they pointed out at ships in the bay. And they said, see that ship over there? And I said, yeah, there's been lots of them as we've been here this week. And they said, yeah, we don't know where that ship is from. We don't know how long it's going to be here. Sometimes they anchor and they send other ships to shore. We don't know what they're doing. We don't know what country they're from. And worse, if they were to have an oil spill, we don't know how we would clean it up. So they said, if I could know one thing and one thing only, it would be, when is the next ship going to come into this bay? And I was left shaking my head. And I said, we in Canada, we're leaders. We're leaders in tracking ships from space. We have antennas on the RadarSat constellation mission known as AIS, Automated Information Systems. And they track ships. And we have that data. And yet that data isn't getting to the northern communities. And that poses security challenges and risks. Another important challenge in the north is data, access to broadband. You know, we take for granted that our cell phones can connect with anybody here. If I'm out on the street and I get lost and I don't know where I am, I'm just a click away from my family, from a taxi cab, from the police. Well, that's not true in the north. Now, a lot of people say, hey, we solved that problem. Just yesterday, we launched more Starlink satellites. There's 7,000 plus satellites in space. Everybody has internet. We solved that problem, right? Not true, not true. If you look at where those satellites are, they're serving mostly the 60th parallel and south. And so the people in the north, yes, they do have some access to Starlink. I use Starlink in my house. I live in rural Manitoba. And yet that direct-to-handset access is not available. So part of our research, which is funded and directed at the University of Manitoba, but co-developed with Indigenous and Inuit, Métis, and First Nations people, is to develop aerospace technologies such as airships that can provide broadband access to the handset of hunters and trappers so that not if, but when they run into trouble, they can communicate with their communities, with their healers, with their elders, with their families. And this is providing critical information that not only helps their security, but helps improve equity across Canada and around the world, and speaks to the reconciliation and collaboration that Dr. Pinto spoke about today. So I'm thrilled to talk about this all today with this incredible panel that I'm honored to be with, and again, honored to follow the Honorable Mike Spence from Churchill. So thanks very much today.
Thanks, Phil, and it's a good segue to more detailed discussions on security, and security of a different nature. So I'm going to turn to Christian Luprec first to elaborate on that aspect.
Bonjour, mesdames et messieurs. I'll 5 minutes, and I'll try to make 5 points here about the threat environment that we live in, the vulnerabilities, some of the mitigation strategies, how we talk about security and what it means to us, and then a broader conceptual issue about how we think about the current environment, how we need to shift our thinking. So the first point on the threat environment, that we live in an environment where malign foreign actors are actively engaging, as many of you know, in foreign influence and in foreign interference and malign influence. And that is happening at your universities today in terms of espionage, in terms of theft of data and IP, in terms of sabotage, subterfuge, and subversion. It's also happening. I had a call just a couple of weeks ago from a university that believes that its procurement and logistics system is actively being co-opted by an organized criminal organization in order to engage in money laundering. Inherently, we have relatively modest financial controls at many universities, and we're relatively open systems, so they're relatively easy to exploit. We're relatively networked. It's relatively easy for foreign actors to find their way into our research ecosystem and to use tools of hybrid warfare as well as gray zone tactics in order to undermine the publicly funded, taxpayer-funded research and co-opt it for their particular nefarious purposes. Some of the elements that are available open access, for instance, some of the reporting the Globe and Mail has done in terms of drone technology that has been funded by Canadian taxpayers at Canadian institutions that is subsequently in collaborations with entities in both Iran and Russia is now being weaponized against our interests in Ukraine by Russia with Iranian drones. And there's lots of other examples that I can give you in terms of dual-use technology. And so us being a bit more prudent about the way we protect the research that ultimately we generate. You'll have read just in the last week about the way China has infiltrated in the worst sort of security infiltration ever in our telecom system, the key backbone of the telecom system in the United States. You'll have also read about how US-developed artificial intelligence is actively being weaponized by China in its defense industrial complex. Second, what you heard from His Worship is a very important dimension of this conversation, because there's a host of vulnerabilities, but some of the greatest vulnerabilities that we face is in our rural and is in our northern communities. And the challenges that these communities face are already actively being exploited by foreign actors in order to undermine our way of life and to undermine those communities. And so it is incumbent upon us to make these communities more resilient so that they're not subject to the sort of instrumentalization by foreign actors that the weaknesses and the vulnerabilities in these communities make them disproportionately subject to. The third point about how do we mitigate risk in these areas. And so I think one of the basic questions that I need to ask ourselves, how do we ensure that we are sufficiently aware that we don't inadvertently become enablers of these tools of hybrid warfare, of gray zone tactics, and exploitation? As you know, the government of Canada has after several years of pondering it very, very hard and taking a very long time, finally has a research security policy. You could read both the report by the Science Committee as well as the separate report on the National Microbiology Lab by the Canada-China Parliamentary Committee. I've been a long-time critic of the approach that is currently taking. You can see that the latest parliamentary committee report appears to be on side with my criticism, that there are some areas where we can manage the risk in terms of collaboration and where we have global challenges, environmental challenges, for instance, where we need to find ways to work together. But there are other areas where these risks simply cannot be mitigated. If you're working in anything related to computing, if you're working in anything relating to artificial intelligence, anything related to analytics, anything related to electric vehicle batteries, for instance, there is simply no way to mitigate the risk that collaborating with entities in adversarial and hostile countries pose. In other areas, there may be mechanisms to mitigate that risk. Ontario, for instance, has now probably I think the most robust mechanism at a provincial level to mitigate against these types of research risks, and has built very constructive relationships with universities and VP's research. Part of this inherently depends then on your provincial ecosystem. Part of it also depends on the type of research that you're doing and how vulnerable that research might be to exploitation or to a nefarious actor. The other is the debate around listed entities. Inherently, there need to be listed entities because universities need to know and researchers need to know what are the entities that we shouldn't be working with. I believe that the federal government's list is far too narrow and far too short. It only includes public sector entities. It does not include private sector entities. So what is a public sector university or research entity that is on the list in an adversarial country going to do? They're simply going to set up a private sector front company, and all of a sudden you can collaborate with that private sector front company. It presents exactly the same risk. And of course, in several of these adversarial countries, the distinction between private and public sector that we have in Canada doesn't apply because they're deeply intermeshed, intermingled, and codependent on one another. My fourth point is how we talk about security, and that's where I get back to what we heard from His Worship about the North. We often think about sort of security as sort of the hard security elements. But if you think about the North, and communities in the North will tell you, what is their greatest security risk? It is elements of human security. It is elements of food security. And so understanding that when we talk about security, it can mean very different things to different peoples into different contexts. And so when we talk about research security, what that actually means to local communities, to researchers, to politicians, and to bureaucrats, we use the same referent, but we mean very different things. So making sure that we're actually on the same page to ensure that we're talking about the same issues. And the last is my pitch for a shift in thinking. So the challenges that we face are largely challenges, transnational challenges, and associated with challenges of mobility. Everything from foreign influence, sort of malign influence, foreign interference, but also if you think of pollution, if you think of theft of your data through the internet, if you think of transnational financial crime, that's including in our own universities. But the way we've set ourselves up to govern is an ontology that is based on state and territory. It is based on these conventional boundaries. It is based on 19th century bureaucratic structures that operate within those particular boundaries, and it is based on legislative, policy, and regulatory processes that are ultimately contingent and constrained by these territorial and state boundaries, where we live in this globalized and highly digitized international world. And so my shift is one that we have an ontology of state and territory, but what we actually need is an epistemological shift towards mobility that is able to overlay that dimension of territory with an epistemological dimension of mobility to make us more aware of these transnational and mobility challenges that we face when we talk about these different referents of security and how it relates to research. Je vous remercie.
Merci, Christian. Over to you, Andrea.
Thanks very much. I'm going to use the podium. Bon matin. Good morning, everyone. My research focuses on your Canadian Armed Forces. I spend a lot of time thinking about things like command and control, the platforms it needs, and increasingly its readiness level. And my bottom line up front is that climate change especially is becoming one of the #1 factors impacting the Canadian Armed Forces' ability to operate both at home, in North America, and overseas. The Canadian Armed Forces is one of the primary tools for the Government of Canada to achieve a variety of foreign and defense policy goals. The Royal Canadian Air Force is celebrating its 100th anniversary this year. And for most of the history of the Canadian Armed Forces, we've thought of it as an expeditionary force. It is sent away from Canada to deal with instability, crises, and conflicts in the rest of the world. And this is the best way for Canada to show itself as a good ally, to reinforce the rules-based international order, and to keep Canada safe. But climate change is what we call a threat multiplier. Its effects and outcomes means that the operating environment for the Canadian Armed Forces and militaries across the world has fundamentally changed. Some of the effects and impacts you know very, very well. It results in storms that are happening more frequently and more violently. It is changing temperature levels to quite extremes. We see sea level rise. We see climate change contributing to mass migration. It creates the conditions for conflict in societies that are fragile and frail, especially if governments are unable or unwilling to respond. It's also a vector for new health pandemics and pathogens. And all of these then affect the operating environment. It's no longer the case that the CAF can worry about deploying and focusing on a quote unquote enemy or adversary. Climate change is absolutely changing how they do their core business. And it comes in a variety of ways. So for example, when you have sea level rise, all of a sudden your port infrastructure and your ability to berth becomes really complicated. When you have permafrost melt, you do not want to land something like an F-35, a very, very expensive platform, on a runway that is buckling. It's also the case that when you have increases in temperature and you add changes to air density, it can have a fundamental effect on rotary and fixed wings aircraft. All of these mean that the operating environment for the Canadian Armed Forces at home and overseas has changed. But it's at home where we see the greatest changes to Canadian Armed Forces readiness levels. you may have heard of something called Operation Limpid. The Canadian Armed Forces names all of its missions and operations, and one of the great things about that is you can capture all of the personnel, the platforms used, the cost of these operations. And Operation Limpid is the Canadian Armed Forces assistance to provincial and territorial governments. And in the last few decades, the number of OPLIMPID missions has doubled. So in 2023, we had 8 requests. The average between 2017 and 2021 was 4. Previous to that, it was only 2. This means that the Canadian Armed Forces has to make crucial decisions. They cannot do these missions and keep up with an operational tempo with NORAD, with NATO, with the UN. We also have other missions that have a climate change impact. For example, Operation Palisade, which is the Canadian Armed Forces support to Parks Canada in avalanche mitigation. It requires deploying howitzers and gunners to be able to shoot at and have controlled avalanches before they wipe out critical infrastructure. But of course, that again takes away equipment, logistics, and capabilities that maybe should be used somewhere else. And finally, for search and rescue, the Canadian Armed Forces is responsible for aeronautical search and rescue. But because of their what we call unlimited liability, they can be sent to die. That is what they sign for when they become a Canadian Armed Forces members. With search and rescue situations becoming more and more fraught and more difficult, it means that the CAF has now become the force of first rather than last resource. The good news is that NATO, for example, is starting to think more about this. Canada is supporting and hosting a center of excellence focused on that climate security nexus. We have a climate resilience, environmental sustainability, science and technology strategy for the Department of Defense, and a climate and sustainability strategy. That's the good news. The bad news is we still lack a civilian equivalent to OPLIMPID. We still struggle to integrate what is increasingly needed to be a whole of society effort. And finally, we need all Canadians to be more resilient so that we don't need to call the Canadian Armed Forces to shovel snow, to assist with wildfires. We need to have other resources and society itself planning for those missions. Otherwise, our ability, the Canadian Armed Forces' ability to defend Canada, to defend North America, and to operate overseas will be curtailed.
Merci, Andrea. And now finally, I'll call on Hans-Joachim to provide the university perspective on research security.
Thank you, Mario. I will quickly, trapped between all of those kind of direct dimensions in which we are drawn as a society is the university setting, which is basically the, it's absolutely critical to address these multidimensional changes, so culturally, as well as technology, as well as research-wise. And so our role here at the university is to address climate change and the outcomes out of that through innovation, research, and human talent. And that gives us an experience about the movability of that dimension. And university research is often primarily driven by researchers which have a research program rather than a research project. So we are talking about longer time periods in which these research programs are developed, the career paths of the researchers, the relationships that the researchers build with the communities in which they are doing their research, with their graduate students, and with their research projects. The dependence of research projects on collaborations is fundamentally important, in particular with exchange of ideas, exchange of talent, exchange of experimental resources, tapping into the resources a country provides. And as such, the the exchange of information very early on in the discovery or the invention pipeline is critical for progress. And often, and in this context that we're just describing, in particular in a space where we're responding quickly to changes in the climate and the outcomes for societies, we realize very late that some of the technologies we are exchanging have dual use character. And that's what Christian was talking about earlier today, is the assessment of technology as we are developing it prior to any deployment of that through human resources or through the publication process is something that is novel to researchers in the grand scheme of things. And I think as an open science and curiosity-driven research institution, creating awareness internally of dual-use potential and risks associated with research is a challenge that one has to address and that we as an institution have to do. This is particularly important because most of these long-lasting relationships are multinational, multi-state involving, or basically global interactions. And the whole concept of exchanging those ideas and having impact on a solution that is taking place in the north, for instance, based on an effect that is happening at on the southern part of the world is a new concept for research and for research institutions to deal with. So with that, I would like to just make the point that working in a changing environment where research opportunities, research funding depends on the global geopolitical situation and the risk assessment is a novelty to the universities to adjust to, and that we're challenged with. I guess that's what I would say. Thank you.
Thank you, H.J. With that, we're going to move on to the next section where I'll ask each of the panelists to elaborate on their opening statements. I asked them to keep it brief so that we can move on to a Q&A session with the audience. So, Mike, if I can get you to start, you gave us a very good description of the role of the deepwater port at Churchill and the role it will play in the Arctic and the local communities. Would you care to elaborate on some of the challenges that you are facing and also the opportunities that you see if one were able to overcome those challenges?
Thank you. You know, it's, we're all challenged, but at the same time, we're challenged for for finding the opportunity, and that's where we need to go. And we've always been that in the region here. You know, we've been always focused on partnerships. The importance of, in this case, it's really critically important that we continue the engagement with science and research. You know, coming together. Together, like the REACH program, for instance, you know, providing support and information so that it can help guide us. You know, you're guiding local and national leaders, traditional knowledge coming together. In this case, as you know, the port is underutilized. It was underutilized because of, you know, it was run by the government of Canada at one point. And then it went off to a company that brought it down. We lost, in the region, we lost 20 to 30 years back. So it's, you know, looking at how we can address steps going forward in terms of whether it's the outdated insurance policies relating to shipping, data collected for these studies, so to inform policy providers, you know, in turn to extend the shipping seasons. You know, it's critical that we do that. With increased shipping, naturally, the port can serve as an instrumental role in providing goods and service not only to the region, but globally. You know, this is a seaport, Canada's only Arctic seaport. So positioning the region for growth, economic development opportunities, creating this gateway, this Arctic gateway that needs to happen. You know, increased traffic comes with its challenges naturally. So a collaboration approach is needed across jurisdictions to ensure that benefits and impacts are being balanced. The trick here is we need to find a balance so that we can succeed.
Thank you, Mike. And Phil, if I can riff off Mike's comments and talk about your work with the indigenous communities in Chesterfield Inlet, and you've been working very intimately with them. How do you see the research and innovation piece in universities in concert with these indigenous communities contributing to what the mayor has just outlined?
Yeah, that's a great question, Dr. Pinto, and it absolutely follows very well from what we just heard from Mayor Mike. I think one of the major benefits that we've seen recently has been a shift in our definition of what research is, and it's a shift in the right direction, I think. It's a shift towards community co-development. This is a recognition that these communities that we work with, that we collaborate with, we're not just doing research and plunking it at their feet. They are active participants and actively leading this research. As Mayor Mike pointed out, both Mike Spence there from Churchill as well as Lavinia Brown from Rankin Inlet are leading this important nation-building research project that we're calling REACH, which is reimagining global shipping through central Canada and up through Hudson Bay. And I think some of the things that we sort of traditionally have felt about traditional research programs are now being challenged. You know, we've often, 10, 20 years ago, many universities thought, well, we're doing research for the Arctic and we're going to find some research findings and leave it with them. But now we're turning that on its head. And my colleagues are all saying, boy, you know, these people that we work with in the Arctic, they are all researchers. They maybe don't have the same kinds of PhDs or research labs that we are used to here in the South, but they are researchers. They collect data about how their climate is changing. They do experiments. They understand the wildlife, they understand the land, and they provide as much, if not more, definitely more, than what we provide as researchers from the South. So when I think about the partnerships that I have both in Churchill and in Chesterfield Inlet, I think about that partnership. We've hired researchers that are now working full-time in Chesterfield Inlet that are working with us down south in Winnipeg and across Canada to understand how they communicate, how data is shared across the community. When I was in the community last, you know, we all fly into the airport and the community members come to pick us up. And they were picking up packages, and they said, oh, I'm waiting for a new package. And I said, what are you waiting for? And they said, a radio. And I thought, oh, you mean like a walkie-talkie? And he said, no, I mean like the town's radio station went down the other day, and we need to fix it. And so I'm waiting for a new radio from Amazon. And I thought, oh, okay, you know, that's nice. They play some music. But everybody that I spoke to in the community that week said to me, oh, you know, the radio's down. And I was left scratching my head because I thought, you know what, I like the CBC, I listen to the CBC, but if it was to just stop today, I don't think it would really affect the rest of my day, right? I mean, as well, I wouldn't listen to the CBC, but for that community, that's how they communicate. They say, oh, you know, somebody needs to have a ride to school, or somebody needs to be away on a sled later today. Could you come and watch my kids for me for an hour while I'm away? They use the radio station to communicate. And so this is just, it illustrates some of the differences on how people communicate and how this collaboration, this community collaboration between researchers here at the University of Manitoba and across Canada and the researchers, and I want to say that in bold and italics, the researchers that we work with in these communities are absolutely critical to solving these hard problems across Canada.
Thanks, Phil. I want to move on to the issue of geopolitical challenges and turn to Christian to ask him to elaborate on the limitations imposed upon us on how we collaborate in the North, but based on geopolitical challenges elsewhere. For example, the South China Sea. Right? And I've just returned from Australia, where I did 3 years, and the activity in the South China Sea is alarming. But Christian, if you could comment on those aspects. How do events elsewhere affect what we are talking about in collaborations in the North?
So it's a lovely question. So I spent a year in Australia, and that prompted me to work with some of the Australian institutions to do a book that we subsequently called Polar Cousins. And it's about trying to think about the two poles, not as these separate entities, but as lots of the geopolitical challenges are related challenges. And of course, if you want to see change happen in the world, nowhere else in the world is change happening more quickly than at the polar caps of the world. And the change that is happening there is having very significant geopolitical ramifications. And the North used to be, from a security perspective, flyover country. If you're in the 1950s, intercontinental ballistic missiles that might sort of hit somewhere on the continent. Well, the North is now a contested geopolitical area in and of itself. The resources that are at play in the North, the territory itself, including the maritime staging grounds, and the people that ultimately inhabit that part of the world. And anybody who's been in the North will know just how rapidly it's changing. And so, on the one hand, this is where research can have very significant impact in terms of asserting our national interests, but it is also inherently where research is disproportionately vulnerable and communities are vulnerable to exploitation. And I would say one of the things that is probably the most challenging is, where do we place our trust and who are our trusted partners when we work together? And so the first thing, of course, that in terms of Andreas and Philip's comments and what we heard from his worship is, we have a lot of ground to make up in building trust with our local communities and in particular our indigenous communities. As a Canadian community as a whole, but also as individual researchers. And Philip's point being taken, I think, very seriously, that the research must be mutually beneficial. And I think as researchers, we can often be our worst enemies where we prioritize the research and the payoff from that research that we do for ourselves as rational choice academics and getting the next grant and getting the next publication, as opposed to making sure that that research has benefit for the community. But helping us think about the community also helps us think about research security, because if we think about the local community, we can also think about the national community. How do we ensure that on the one hand, that research is of greatest benefit to Canada, to our partners and allies, but if we think from a national security and national interest perspective, it can also help us then think about, well, where and how and to whom might that research be valuable, who might be looking to exploit that research for nefarious purposes, either because that research is directly beneficial, because that research can be weaponized within our own society to undermine our political institutions, our prosperity, our social harmony, or because that research ultimately has potential or actual dual-use applications. And so thinking about and working with local communities, I think provides us with very significant payoffs. And this is really important in a research community where, look, we have very few sticks when it comes to profs. Any of you who've worked with profs, the stick approach usually doesn't work. So we only have carrots, right? So this is very much about changing the tenor of the conversation, the quality of the conversation, the quantity of the conversation, the domain awareness that we have of the work that we're doing and the implications that it ultimately has. And if you want to continue those conversations in a more operational and tactical fashion, many of you will know that all Canadian universities now have research security officers being funded by the federal government. I'm not sure we have the funding formula quite right for those research security officers, but many of them come from a background within the security and intelligence community. And so you have interlocutors locally that can help you advance that conversation in your university and that can help you do the risk mitigation on your grants and how you engage with communities. But I'd say that ultimately, if that gets pushed back to you because they've identified a potential risk that needs to be mitigated, it suggests that you haven't thought hard enough about your relationship with your local communities, with your national community, and the geopolitical environment in which your research is being conducted. And so you want to get that already to a point where when your granting council looks at it and puts it through its research and security and risk mitigation practices, it will come through with flying colors. And that's, I think, the gold standard we should all be aspiring to.
Thank you, Christian. I'm going to turn to Andrea now. And if you would share your perspective on Canada's role in the Arctic as a nation and as a member of NATO.
Well, that's a great question. Canada's Arctic is 40% of our land mass. We have 150,000 people who live there. But the Arctic Ocean, the smallest ocean, has always been the avenue of approach in terms of the fastest way to attack any country. This is why we have the North American Aerospace Defense Command, and this is why it's always focused in the Arctic, and why you're seeing and hearing so much attention on new domain awareness platforms like the Arctic Over-the-Horizon Radar and the Polar Over-the-Horizon Radar, and why things like the Chinese balloon incident in February of 2023 is so concerning, because one of the things that the Canadian Armed Forces and allies need is more domain awareness. With the 8 Arctic countries, 7 are now NATO states. The Arctic used to be what we called an exceptional zone of peace. Russia is one of the largest Arctic actors by population, frontage, capabilities, you name it. But there's a definite rift between the NATO states and Russia for activity in Ukraine, in Syria, and elsewhere. And whereas through the Arctic Council and things like the Arctic Coast Guard Forum, and even through NATO, through the Russia-NATO Council, they were able to have conversations of friction points elsewhere. These increasingly are not possible. And because of the lack of domain awareness in the Arctic, it means that we are an accident, an incident, or a misperception away from things escalating really quickly. And that's why the Arctic is such a focus of attention for the Canadian government. And it goes exactly to what Phil does. It's about domain awareness. Do we know what is happening in the Arctic so that we have time and space to come up with other options? We don't want the kinetic response. We don't want to be scrambling F-18s. What we want to be able to do is see the activity happening far enough in advance that maybe there can be a conversation with ambassadors. Maybe it's adjusting the sanctions. Maybe it's bringing it up at the UN Security Council.
Thanks, Andrea. And over to you, Shay. Could you comment from the perspective of a research-intensive university on the geopolitical landscape and how it impacts research in general? And has it really changed our modes of operation within the universities?
Thank you, Mario. So we, as we have just heard, universities have a research security office, which we are at the University of Manitoba just establishing. And so we get into this conversation about research security. Now, what I was saying earlier is that researchers and the research activity in universities is critical to addressing the challenges in the North or any basic immediate, well, they're the solution providers for the challenges that we as a society are having. And these solutions will be built in a collaborative effort, and the focus of the researchers typically is to solve the problems and get the technology right. So the language around, I have to build this within a framework where we have to be careful who's going to be using it. Actually, typically researchers are happy when their technology is going to be used, right? And often they feel that there's an inbuilt, that's what we're getting from the conversation that we have with our researchers, there's an inbuilt inferior complex that they don't think nobody cares what I'm doing. So they're happy to share these kind of things. And so now having, as I mentioned earlier, having a generational aspect to research program development, having the societal driver for finding solutions to challenges of global impact, and then being not secure enough to know that what I'm developing might have different implications or applications than I'm intending it to be. So that is a very complex and very, very difficult human situation to navigate from a university point of view. And particularly what is very, very, very new for a large number of new researchers that are getting online after the 80s, I would say, is the fact that what you can research, how you can research, and with whom you can research is a function of the geopolitical situation. And that is something that it changes. It's a paradigm change. And it is something that needs to be embedded into the training. And so the way we are using this at the university is an approach where we have conversations with the researchers about this and providing some educational space to this. What is the risk assessment? And creating awareness about the methodologies that they can use or the way how they can communicate that. And fundamentally, the dialogue is not different than the dialogue that we had when it came up to other, or will be coming up, with respect to disrupting technologies like AI. Like, how do you deploy AI? What kind of traceability, what are the safety/security elements within AI? Same as for biotechnology. We all remember the longer discussion about when synthetic biology came up, and that's like a general wealth generator, but there is inherent potential of malicious actor and dual use to this. Like that's the rational design of a biological weapon. How much information are we going to be sharing? Is that impacting the way how we're going to do the research and what information we can share? How do we fund this? So it's a very related topic, and the conversation just has to be shifted towards a more national security and a dual use aspect in that context of Canada, I would think. And so the policy that the Canadian government has put in place, I think is very helpful for us to implement and having that conversation going, because it's not a stick, it's a carrot-based approach with a little bit of stick to it, which is kind of that something that we can which we can communicate. And what I very would like really to emphasize is the fact any restriction in technology development and deployment, that's why we have to do this in a conscientious way, will impact the communities that actually need this. I mean, that's why the connection to the North here is very important, because we see the dramatic change in the communities and in the livelihood and the food security and their personal security of the members of the northern communities. So we need to be able to deploy this in a secure, in a safe way. And the innovation that we're doing needs to be deployed in a way that is safe and secure. So we have to have a discussion about this, but it's impacting us as a nation, or as a society, or as a country, how we deal with that. And it can be a defining event for us, how we handle that.
Can I ask you a quick follow-up?
Absolutely.
Is that okay?
Yeah.
So I mean, obviously we're in front of a large collection of academics here across Canada. Where do those security challenges that you just talked about intersect with academic freedom?
Yeah, interesting question. So what can that's basically what I was saying. What can I research, what can I not research? I would like to do the example that we know from biotechnology development. So for instance, to study the flu is an interesting, so you want to look into the history of how the flu evolved and what are the transmission mechanisms, or like, how do you, so for that you need to revive an old virus, for instance, right? So the conversation about how this virus works, I think is societally beneficial. Do you really have to share the technical details of how you revive that virus? That's an interesting question to have. So we call that something like that's an information hazard issue that you have to have, right? And that's a discussion that you also can have with publishers, for instance. How much information do you have to share to get actually to the benefit of the research output? Right. I think that's
interesting.
Good. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I think you've heard different aspects of the security question, and mainly within the context of our northern communities. I'm going to throw the floor open to questions now, and any suggestions you might have, and in particular, who do you think needs to be at the table to discuss and develop strategies and implementations based on what you have heard? But I believe there are 2 mics, stand-up mics. Please feel free to use them, and please don't be shy. Yes, sir.
Thanks so much for the broad, wide-ranging conversation. As a research security advisor tasked with implementing these policies at the university level, I'll kind of offer my perspective. Christian, on the first point around private sector partnerships, all federal granting agencies require private sector partnerships to be assessed at the point of grant application through the National Security Guidelines for Research Partnerships. That's been in place since 2021 for NSERC grants and expanded now for all tri-agencies and CFI. So they are looking into private sector partnerships. Setting up a shell company would be easily identified by teams like ours, that universities and maybe on that NRO list. And my question is around what risks we are assessing. So you mentioned unmitigatable risks, potentially even around electric vehicle battery technology, and banning those, probably at the nation state level is what I'm kind of hearing between Canadian partnerships. And I mean, we're talking about climate change. Chinese EV batteries are largely twice the range of what North American electric vehicles offer currently. We need that technology to combat climate change. So when we're discussing risks, are climate-related risks assessed in the same way that economic security risks are? From my perspective, not always. So I just wanted to kind of present that to the panel.
Thank you for that. Who would like to comment on the panel?
Well, I'll immediately push back on the shell companies. So you can read my book, Dirty Money, Financial Crime in Canada. So if you can readily identify those shell companies, come and talk to me, because I expect they'll be happy to hire you to run the Financial Crime Coordination Center that the government of Canada is looking to stand up. Because actually identifying how these shell companies are set up and how money actually flows and who owns what is exceptionally difficult, especially in a country like Canada, where 8 out of 10 provinces have no beneficial ownership registry, and the federal registry effectively excludes everybody with revenues under $250,000. So effectively, we currently capture about 10% of corporations within Canada. Now you go to tax havens and the like, and you structure this successfully across the world. So I don't know who you're talking to, but the people that I know who do financial crime investigations in this country have serious difficulties figuring out those shell companies, because it's not going to be your one of the Seven Sisters in China setting up an obvious shell company that's directly linked to the Seven Sisters. It will be linked across the world. If you have any doubts about that, you can talk to my friend Ben Fang at McGill University, who has been quite public about the way that he has been repeatedly approached by a private sector actor in China. And in the process, it has become apparent how some of those shell companies how some of the international construct behind which researchers are lured in ways that are actively deceptive in terms of the collaborations that they're getting themselves into actually works. So Ben has repeatedly spoken about this publicly. So as I say, if you think you can identify those shell companies readily, let me know. There's lots of people who would love to draw on your knowledge, because the people that I know have great trouble with that. Mm-hmm. So on elements where the risk can simply not be mitigated, sure, there's lots of technologies where ultimately other entities are further ahead. Why are they further ahead? Well, one of the reasons why a company such as Huawei is further ahead, because of course China effectively exfiltrated all the IP for a company called Nortel that was the single largest employer of engineers in this country in the 1970s and 80s, and was the global leader in communications infrastructure technology. So let's understand that the technology and the IP that we are developing today is actively being harnessed by our geopolitical rivals and competitors precisely to outpace us. And so I think it is somewhat curious to me as to why we would then collaborate with entities that have effectively stolen our taxpayer publicly funded research and our intellectual property to get further ahead, and now come back to us and say, oh, we'd like to work with you because with your stolen research, we can now essentially lure you back into working with us so we can steal more of your IP. Sure, we need to have some of these collaborations. I think we can have constructive working relationships, but these are ultimately based on trust. And I would say China has shown itself repeatedly not to be a trustworthy partner. And so we need to be vigilant. So just having a healthy sense of skepticism.
Mm-hmm.
I was going to just add, I think at a research level, one of the things we need to start thinking about is how our research question may have been shaped by dis and malinformation. And likewise, how adversaries can use our research questions against us as well. I think we have been in a bit of a bubble, and the assumption is that there are no nefarious actors out there, but they are incredibly good at manipulating us, manipulating how research questions come about, and thinking about how you protect your information and your data, including things like, do you have burn laptops? For some places where you go and people whom you interact with, you absolutely want to have a laptop that goes into an incinerator after you've had that conversation, and is not something you then take home and plug into your university or your institution's center. Finally, because of geopolitics, many of our models are horribly skewed. And permafrost melt is a big one because Russia, of course, has the largest area, and it is refusing to provide any of its permafrost data because of sanctions against them. So we are being held hostage by Russia and its nefarious activities elsewhere, and is fundamentally skewing and affecting the models we use to be able to mitigate climate change.
Thank you for that. I'm going to move on to another question. Mike is yours.
Well, thank you. It's been an interesting discussion. I'm Gordon McBain. I'm a climate scientist. And I just wanted to, as I walked up here, I had thought of certain things to say, but since I've been listening to your response to the last comment, I'll change my point. I just wanted to try and say more positively that there is working together of the global science community on addressing the climate change issues. I'm actually the former president of the International Council for Science, and found it very effective to work together with international communities in the science progress. And just incidentally, I happened to be in Taiwan last week I'm on 3 of their advisory committees, and we had some really good discussions with a number of scientific people from around the world, as well as the Taiwanese scientists. There was a recognition, of course, of the issues with the other China across the water. But they were working together on some very interesting issues that I hadn't previously heard about. And I think the cooperation across the science community can be very helpful in terms of trying to address the issues which you're talking about. But let's say I found it interesting. Just incidentally, I am a former lieutenant in the Royal Canadian Horse Artillery as an officer. Anyway, we won't go into all that stuff.
Thanks very much,
It's
Gordon.
interesting topics, but I think, though, that there are some opportunities by working across issues. And my last comment, just to say positively, I was more than once put on committees because when the Russian and Chinese members nominated me to be the chair, they said, after I said, yes, that would be nice, go ahead and nominate me. They said, of course, laughingly, your biggest advantage, Gordon, is you speak English, but you're not an American or a Brit. And so we have some opportunities as Canadians to work in this international community in ways that can be proactive to address issues. Thank you.
Thanks for your comments, Gordon.
Oh, sorry, can I just make a
Yes.
quick comment on that? I thank you for that. And I think it's really important that we're not demonizing all researchers and whole groups of people because of the action of their governments. But I am conscious that COP29 is going on right now, and it is being absolutely manipulated by many national and industry strategies and agendas that are missing the bigger point of how are we going to tackle this thing called climate change, which is a fundamental existential threat to life.
Just thank you. Just quickly, if I could have one more quick comment, Mario. By chance, the topic she just brought up is what I was going to ask you all at coffee break today, because I'm asked there's a journal called The Conversation, and they asked me to write an article. How is COP29, if anything, doing helpful towards addressing the climate change issue? And since it ends today without approving anything, my assessment is very much like you just said. We'll have a chat at the break.
Yes, let's take it up at coffee. So over here, just so you can move things on.
Just 20 seconds. I mean, just like we need to decouple in some areas of research, we also need to be deliberative about having these conversations. And of course, the Fulbright program in the United States was a deliberate political instrument to have conversations with researchers during the Cold Wars in areas where we could work together. So at the same time that we're decoupling, we need to be intentional about where we do want to work together so we can keep those conversations going and keep building those bridges.
Good point. Good point. And over here, thank you for your patience.
No problem, thank you. I found it very interesting. You have this sort of contrasting opinion about research. And so Phil kind of spoke about how the definition of research is changing, who is a researcher is changing, and these collaborations, especially in the North and amongst Indigenous peoples, are becoming increasingly important. Yet at the same time, you have some of these rules that are coming into place for university researchers. And if, let's say, the tri-agencies are expanding eligibility for certain types of communities or researchers who wouldn't traditionally be in a university setting, I was wondering if there's been any thought or discussion about how those two pieces might be in contrast. So who is making the rules for what research is and how that's interacting with indigenous knowledge, and how people might be viewing the research that belongs to them that they need, but might be at odds with national security, especially in the North.
Thank you for that. Phil, would you like to start?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, and it was only 4 or 5 years ago when we were in this terrible position where we were trying to do collaborative research with Indigenous people, and we weren't able to give research dollars to them to do the research. So I think we're definitely seeing a positive shift there. But you raise an interesting question. I mean, where does that collide with the same kinds of research discussions that we just had? I think one of the things that is maybe too obvious to point out is that I will say these Indigenous people in Canada are Canadians, and they work with us in this country. I do think that there is a strong distinction between working with other Canadian communities and working with other countries that have been identified as nefarious actors, I will say. And I guess the other thing that I'll say too is that in all of my colleagues that I've ever worked with, I have yet to find anybody more honest and sincere and genuinely interested in research than my Indigenous colleagues. They are one with the land, they're one with the environment, and they have a perspective that I think exceeds most of us. We often talk about wanting to work collaboratively and cross-disciplinary, and I mean, I think that's baked into their way of life. I'm going to get this wrong, Mario, but you can help me. Wahkoten?
Yes.
So Wahkoten is a philosophy, a way of life that means kinship. And it's something that is exuded by Indigenous collaborators, and it helps inform our research of how our research impacts the land, how it impacts the communities. And so I think personally, as opposed to looking at these collaborations as a potential threat, I look to them as a way for us to actually improve our research security because of its connection with the land. But I'd be interested in other people's perspectives.
Well, this is why the Canadian Armed Forces does not operate in the Arctic without the Canadian Rangers, which it's a subcomponent of the Army Reserve, and it's local and Indigenous communities in remote and coastal states that, because of their local and Indigenous knowledge, can help the CAF understand the terrain and the conditions that they're going to be facing in an Arctic context. And you cannot deploy the CAF without having that knowledge.
Thank you. Another question over here.
Yeah, my name's Bob Walker, and during the Afghan War, I was the departmental chief scientist for national defense. And I want to compliment this panel for bringing to the fore what I see as a new conversation emerging over the course of the last 2 days. And I'd frame it like this. If we think of our national science, technology, and innovation ecosystem, I think what I'm hearing is we're finally waking up to that this needs to be a strategic national asset, an asset that is in a serious business that matters to the economic, social, and security of our citizens, including Mayor Mike's community. And to take that, we need multiple players in this ecosystem that come together to do their part. And by building that common sense of purpose, we build relevance for communities, relevance for citizens. With relevance comes credibility, with credibility comes trust, and with trust comes investment. So I want to compliment the CSPC. I think you started an enormously important conversation. The whole reality of research security is table stakes to enter the fray. Thank you.
Thank you for that comment. I'm going to ask Phil to elaborate on the collection of partners involved in our major project. to provide Arctic accessibility.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we've talked a lot about the Indigenous co-leaders, which include obviously Mike Spence and Elder Lavinia Brown, but it doesn't stop there. And I think one of the things that's so important is that we collaborate not just amongst academics, but governments, Inuit community associations, Transport Canada is another one. Obviously the CAF, the Canadian Air Force. This is a nation-building project that requires all of us from all walks of life to consider. I mean, when we think about when the Canadian National Railway was developed 100 years ago, this connected Canada in ways that we're still reaping benefits from. And this is the scale of the project that we're talking about now. So everybody from elementary school teachers through university professors, through government organizations, community organizations, Indigenous organizations, and everybody in between, the military as well. This project cannot be done by a single scientist, a single research institution, or even a single community. I mean, this is everybody working together, and that's why this project is so foundational for our country. We're looking forward to it.
Christian, very quickly.
Bob, I think what you also allude to is the opportunity to rethink research design and the whole grant and program design, right? I think we've started to do a better job at having research articulate those economic, political, and social benefits. I think in many cases we still do more lip service than actual making sure that we actually track what that research deliver on those. But how nice would it be if under the new tri-council, whatever entity that the government has put forward, we would actually have a process where these applications and public funding needs to demonstrate what is that common purpose? How is this project advancing overall cohesion? And how is this project contributing to relevance? How is it building credibility? How is it building trust? And how might that stimulate subsequent investments if we could actually articulate that and make that part of the actual evaluation process and the subsequent auditing on to what extent researchers actually delivered, so that we also then reward researchers who actually follow through on all this and provide those broader benefits rather than just the benefits to themselves and their own research agenda. I think that would have a monumental impact, and research security officers are a key part of that broader paradigm shift, I think.
Yeah. Thank you. One last question over here.
Hi, Sean Hughes. I work on research security policy at Universities Canada. More of a comment, but like Christian mentioned, the Ontario rules, we now have the STRAC policy federally, the NRC has their policy, and other provinces are starting to look at policies as well. One of the challenges we see when everyone wants to make their own policy is that it really fractures the ecosystem even within Canada. You see, we're starting to see issues with like the Ontario rules. If I'm an Ontario university and I want to partner with another province, 2 Canadian researchers, just in that scenario, I'm now subject to the Ontario universities are subject to the Ontario rules, but the other provinces don't really have any liability in this relationship. And so that kind of prompts the Ontario universities to try and now seek legal assurances from the other institutions. And that comes in the form of maybe indemnity clauses and things like that, but it creates a whole complicated process. So I think research security is important, but we do need to be deliberate in our approach. I think federally is an easier avenue to sort of have a single umbrella for it. And also internationally, we also really need to be speaking with our partners, because what happens if I'm I'm trying to partner with CERN, I'm trying to apply STRAC to a team of 100 researchers. I can't get assurances from everyone. Can I partner with the large or get expertise from the Large Hadron Collider or things like that? Like, we still want our researchers to participate in those things. So just some food for thought in how we approach those things.
Very, very good point. And we do fragmentation really well. And we really should use the present opportunity to get our collective acts together and present a coherent front. And I think that's some of the subtext that we're driving as well. Present coherent fronts whenever possible. So it's a very good point. We're almost out of time. So I'm going to finish this session by asking each panelist to give me one sentence of what they think the hot button items are, and only one sentence. Mayor Mike, could we start with you?
For us in the North, naturally, the importance of collectively working together and the importance of our initiative to reimagine Canada's third seaway through Churchill and the Hudson Bay, that is critical. The foundation for communities to drive social economic development in our region. We want an opportunity as well.
Good. Thank you. Hans-Joachim?
Yes, I wanted to say something about, like, we need to think about how we provide the players in our system with the resources they need to do disengagement responsible. And I think that's in particular in cases where the universities are smaller or the communities are smaller or we're more remote, we need to provide them with the tool set to
Thank you. Andrea?
I would say stovepiping efforts in all areas creates these seams that adversaries are expert at exploiting.
Thank you. Christian?
In response to the last question, research mitigation, making sure we get the transaction costs right in terms of balancing the benefits and the challenges. But I actually think we're on a really good track, especially on what's happening in Ontario on this, and very good buy-in from the institutions.
Good. And Phil?
I'd say community co-development is absolutely central to a secure Canadian future.
Good. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, I think you'll agree with me that we've had a very robust discussion and presentation of different aspects of security, something that's not normally at the forefront in Canadian university, but we've taken on this challenge in the context of working in the North with communities and opening up the Arctic. So please join me in thanking our panelists for a very robust discussion.